There used to be a store where you weren't allowed to touch anything you wanted to buy. You walked in, you grabbed a clipboard and a stubby little pencil, and you wrote down a 6-digit number off a price tag. Then you handed that paper to a stranger behind a counter, paid for something you'd never held, and stood there staring at a hole in the wall, waiting for a conveyor belt to bring it out of a back room you weren't allowed to enter. It was called Service Merchandise, and at one point, it was a $4 billion company with 413 stores in 37 states. This is the story of how the biggest store you weren't allowed to touch built the future of shopping, and then got buried by it. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through every piece of this. The 5 and dime in a small Tennessee town that turned into a Fortune 500 company. The conveyor belt that felt like science fiction. The computer terminal called Silent Sam that taught millions of Americans how to place an order on a screen, 20 years before any of us had email. And we're going to walk through the part nobody likes to talk about, the Vendor Revolt, the empty backrooms, the day after Christmas in 2002 when the doors finally locked for good. If you ever stood at that pickup window with a clipboard in your hand, watching for your box to come around the corner, this one's for you. It started in 1934 in a town called Pulaski, Tennessee, population around 6,000. A husband and wife, Harry and Mary Zimmerman, opened a little 5 and dime on the main drag. They sold the kind of stuff every American 5 and dime sold back then. Sewing thread, hairpins, tin toys, penny candy. They worked it for years. They figured out wholesale, they figured out volume. And then, in 1960, their son had an idea that would change American retail. What if you didn't put the merchandise on the floor? What if you put it in a warehouse out back and just put one of each thing on display? It sounds backwards now. It was backwards. But there was a reason. In 1960, you couldn't put a security tag on a pair of binoculars. You couldn't put a camera on every aisle. The only way to stop a thief was to keep the merchandise locked away. So that's exactly what they did. The customer became a clerk. You wrote the number down, somebody in the back fetched it. You paid, you picked it up. Theft went to almost zero. And the math worked. By 1971, they were standardizing the warehouse-attached showroom across every store. By 1981, 21 years after that first Nashville location, Service Merchandise crossed $1 billion in annual sales. $1 billion. Selling stuff people weren't allowed to touch. And the growth didn't stop. In 1985, they bought a competitor called H.J. Wilson Company for $200 million and picked up locations across the Sun Belt overnight. Every new mall built between 1980 and 1990, somebody at corporate was on the phone trying to anchor a Service Merchandise next to it. If you went into a Service Merchandise in the 1980s, here's what happened first. You walked through the doors and somebody handed you a clipboard. On the clipboard was a 3-part form, white copy on top, yellow underneath, pink on the bottom. They called it an NCR form, no carbon required, and you pressed down hard with the pen so the ink would bleed through to all 3 layers. The white sheet went home with you, the yellow stayed at the store, the pink went to the credit department. You were filling out paperwork before you'd bought a single thing. And then you walked the showroom floor. Everything was there. Cameras, VCRs, toaster ovens, Mr. Coffee, Sony Walkmans behind glass, a working Nintendo on a small TV with the cord taped down. The actual product you'd take home was somewhere else, back in the warehouse in a sealed box with a barcode you'd never see. Every item had a small white tag on a string, 6 digits printed in black. That was the catalog number. That was the only piece of the product you were allowed to take with you when you walked away from the shelf. Anything worth more than $15 was bolted, chained, locked, or tethered. Cameras hung from coiled cables, like phones in a phone booth. Boom boxes were screwed into the display shelf with their backs cut open. You wrote down the catalog number, you wrote down the model, you walked it to the counter, you paid. Then you waited. This is the part everybody who lived it remembers, the pickup window. There was a moment, maybe 10 minutes after you paid, maybe 15, when you'd hear it. the belt would clatter to life. A brown cardboard box would come gliding out of the dark, sliding on metal rollers, and stop right in front of you with a thud. That was your toaster, or your blender. Or, if you were a kid in December, that was the Easy Bake Oven your mom had circled in the catalog 2 months before. People talk about that conveyor belt like it was a scene from a movie. A guy on TikTok recently called it the stuff of legend, and it was. It really was. Service merchandise didn't sell you a product. They sold you the weight. In the early 1980s, service merchandise put computers on the showroom floor. They called them Silent Sam. They were Digital Equipment Corporation terminals, the VT320 series mostly, with monochrome screens that glowed white or green or amber depending on the store. They sat on little stands and you typed your order in yourself. Stop and think about that for a second. In 1985, most Americans had never used a computer. They didn't know what a cursor was. They didn't know what a keyboard felt like. And they were standing in a retail store in Indiana, typing a 6-digit number into a green screen and waiting for it to tell them whether the back room had a Polaroid camera in stock. Silent Sam would tell you. In real time. If your item was out, it'd suggest a substitute. It was a primitive version of what online shopping would eventually become. Not a copy of it, a sketch, a guess. Decades early, drawn in green light on a screen the size of a lunchbox. And then there was the catalog. Every fall, a service merchandise catalog showed up at your house. 600 pages, 8,000 items, thicker than the phone book, and roughly the same weight. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you know that catalog. You know the smell of the ink on the cheap paper. You know the thwack it made when you dropped it on the kitchen floor. Kids would lay on the carpet with it open in front of them and dog-ear every page they wanted something on. Bicycles, walkie-talkies, a telescope. A telescope, for God's sake. You weren't ever getting a telescope, but you circled it anyway. By Christmas Eve, the binding was cracked, the cover was bent, and there was a peanut butter fingerprint on page 412 that nobody would admit to. Service merchandise mailed that catalog to 16 million homes, 16 million kitchen tables every fall. That catalog was a website, it just happened to be made of paper. Most people remember service merchandise for the toys, or for the Nintendo behind the glass, or for the conveyor belt. But the part that paid the bills was something else entirely. By the mid-1990s, service merchandise sold roughly $1 billion worth of jewelry every year, out of total sales of $4 billion. That's one in every $4 coming from the gold cases by the front door. They were the largest watch retailer in the country. They were one of the top jewelry retailers, period. If you got married in America between 1985 and 1995, there's a real chance the ring on your hand came out of a service merchandise display case. In 1990, they launched a national gift registry. By 1993, 90,000 engaged couples had registered with them. Every store could see the same list. Update 1, update all. That was a database, networked across the entire country in 1990. There were Fortune 500 banks that didn't have that yet. Behind all of it sat an automated 752,000 square foot warehouse in Montgomery, New York. Computer-controlled inventory installed in 1985, the closest thing the retail world had to a self-driving factory. They even tested drive-through pickup windows at 2 stores in 1985. You'd phone your order in, drive over, roll down your window, and somebody would hand you a box. They were inventing curbside pickup 40 years before anybody put it on a Target app. In 1995, the company hit $4.05 billion in sales. They made the Fortune 500. They had 28,000 employees. Their CEO, Raymond Zimmerman, went on the Jerry Lewis telethon every year and handed Jerry a check for muscular dystrophy on national television. They had it all: the infrastructure, the customer base, the gift registry, the website. They'd built a logistics machine that should have carried them straight into the year 2000. And then it didn't. Service merchandise didn't get killed by one company. They got outflanked by the whole shape of American retail at once. Picture two customers in 1995. Both of them want a black plastic toaster. Both of them have $40 in their pocket. The first one walks into service merchandise. She gets the clipboard. She writes down the catalog number. She stands in line at the counter. She pays. She walks to the pickup window. She waits 12 minutes. She watches the conveyor belt cough out somebody else's box first, then hers. She drives home with her toaster 45 minutes after she walked in. The second one walks into a Walmart. He grabs the toaster off a shelf. He pays. He drives home. 8 minutes, start to finish. Same toaster, same $40, different century. That was the problem in one image. Service merchandise had perfected something nobody wanted to do anymore. Best Buy and Circuit City made it worse, in a different direction. They built their whole sales floor around letting you mash the buttons on a camcorder. Plug in headphones. Pick up the remote. Hold the thing in your hands before you spent $400 on it. They specialized. They went deep. Service merchandise was still trying to sell you a wedding ring, a Walkman, a chainsaw, and a barbecue grill in the same building. They were a logistics company pretending to be a department store in a market that suddenly wanted specialists. There was another problem, and this one's harder to see. The catalog locked their pricing. Service merchandise printed the book once a year, 600 pages, 8,000 items, all priced in October. Walmart could resticker a shelf in 5 minutes. Service merchandise needed 12 months to change a price on paper. They could adjust some things in store. Most things they couldn't. It didn't sink them on its own, but it slowed them down in a market that was speeding up. The buildings hurt them too. A typical service merchandise was 50,000 square feet, a warehouse-grade box on a mall-grade lease. Walmart filled that floor with merchandise customers grabbed off shelves. Service merchandise filled it with showroom air and backroom inventory the customer never saw. Same square footage, same rent, half the productivity per inch. They had solved the 1965 problem perfectly. They had built the most efficient catalog showroom in American history. The trouble was, by 1995, nobody was trying to solve that problem anymore. In 1997, the company announced 60 store closures. The first cracks were public. The vendors who supplied the toys, the electronics, the housewares, they started watching the books. They started getting nervous. On March 15, 1999, 5 suppliers filed an involuntary bankruptcy petition against service merchandise. Yes, that's right, 5 vendors took the company to court and forced the bankruptcy to happen. Service merchandise didn't choose Chapter 11, it was filed against them. The vendor said the company owed them about $8 million and wasn't paying. The company said it was working on a restructuring plan. The court said it didn't matter. 12 days later, on March 27th, Service Merchandise filed its own voluntary Chapter 11. They listed assets of $1.5 billion against debts of $1.3 billion. On paper, they were still solvent. In practice, the relationship between the store and its suppliers was broken. The Vendor Revolt didn't start the collapse. The collapse had been quietly underway for years. What it did was make recovery impossible. In retail, when the suppliers stop trusting you, the shelves start emptying. And once the shelves are empty, customers stop coming. And once the customers stop coming, the suppliers run for the door. Raymond Zimmerman had retired in April of 1998, a year before all of this. He thought he was leaving a stable company. He was wrong. By 2000, Service Merchandise had given up on the catalog showroom completely. They tried to pivot to a regular retail store, let people grab stuff off the shelves like everybody else. They downsized. They shrank some buildings into jewelry-only formats called Service Select. None of it worked. The buildings were still 50,000 square feet. The rent was still industrial scale. They were paying for warehouse space they didn't need anymore, in cities where the mall traffic had already moved on to Walmart. And then September 11th happened. The economy froze. Christmas shopping in 2001 was the worst in a decade. Jewelry sales, the one thing keeping the company alive, fell off a cliff. On January 4th, 2002, the company announced full liquidation. all 216 remaining stores, all 28,000 employees. Some of those employees had been there for 30 years. They'd started behind the pickup counter when they were 19. They'd worked the jewelry case through 3 recessions and 4 Christmases where the conveyor belt didn't stop running until midnight. They knew the customers by name. They knew which kid in town was getting the bike on layaway. In the last week of business, the manager of a store in Knoxville turned off the conveyor for the last time and just stood there listening to the silence. There was no ceremony. There was a clipboard, there were keys, and then there was a parking lot. The conveyor belts ran one last time, sending out the last of the inventory at 70% off. And then, sometime in early 2002, somebody flipped a switch in the back of every single store, and the rollers stopped turning. Here's the part most people miss. Service merchandise wasn't ahead of the future. They solved the wrong problem perfectly. Think about what they actually built: a central warehouse, a digital order terminal, a massive printed catalog, real-time inventory, a pickup window where the box came to you instead of the other way around. They built an industrial-grade machine for getting products from a stockroom to a customer with zero theft and minimal staff. It was beautiful. It was efficient. It was the answer to a question America stopped asking. The question they solved was, how do you sell stuff people can't be trusted to touch? The question America actually had was, how do you sell stuff to people who don't want to leave the house? Different problem, same warehouses, wrong answer. They taught a generation of Americans how to shop without touching the merchandise. They taught us how to wait. They taught us how to trust a number on a tag. And then the internet showed up, took every one of those habits and built the real version on top of them. The conveyor belt grew up to be a UPS truck. The pickup window grew up to be your front porch. In 2004, Raymond Zimmerman bought the brand name back out of liquidation and put it on a website, servicemerchandise.com. Just an online jewelry store. No showroom, no clipboard, no belt. Service Merchandise didn't fail because their idea was wrong. They failed because they were 40 years right about the wrong half of it. Every time you click Buy Now and wait for a brown box to show up at your door, you're standing at a Service Merchandise pickup window. You're just doing it from your couch. Service Merchandise wasn't the only American institution that built the future and then got buried by it. There's another one. Orange-roofed, 28 flavors, a hotel sign you saw on every interstate in America that did the exact same thing. They invented the modern roadside experience, and then they let it slip through their fingers, one off-ramp at a time. That story's coming next. We'll meet you there.